The will was read on the 14th of October, 1798, in the library of the Vance estate in Albemarle County, Virginia, by the family's attorney, a man named Prescott who had been managing the Vance family's legal affairs for 11 years, and who was himself a precise and careful man, accustomed to the specific drama of the reading of a wealthy patriarch's will, and who was, on the 14th of October, 1798, not prepared for this. He had prepared the document himself, under Silas Vance's direction, in the preceding months of Silas's illness. He had prepared it, and he had not questioned the specific condition it contained, because his professional relationship with Silas Vance did not include the questioning of Silas Vance's directives. And the condition, while unprecedented in his 11 years of practice, and possibly unprecedented in the history of Virginia testamentary law, so far as Prescott could determine, was technically a condition. It was legally expressible as a condition. He had expressed it legally. He had included it in the document, and he had prepared the document, and he had sealed it, and he had brought it to the library of the Vance estate on the 14th of October, and he had read it, including the condition, to the assembled family. The condition was this: any heir of the Vance bloodline who wished to receive their inheritance in full, the estate, the house, the accounts, the properties, the entire material legacy of Silas Vance's 61 years of accumulation, must, within 1 year of the will's reading, undertake to be blind. Not blind in the metaphorical sense, blind in the specific, physical, irreversible sense. The condition did not specify the mechanism, which was the one element of Prescott's drafting that he had been most uncertain about, and that Silas had waived with the specific impatience of a dying man who considered the mechanism a secondary matter. The condition specified only the outcome: blindness, certified by a physician of the estate's choice, permanent, undertaken voluntarily by the heir as the condition of the inheritance. He read this. The family received it. Prescott waited. The library of the Vance estate in October of 1798 was a formal room, a large room, a room that Silas Vance had filled with the specific purchases of a man who understood that a library was the physical expression of an educated mind, and who had applied the considerable resources available to him to this expression consistently since the 1770s. The walls were books. The desk was the large leather-topped desk of a man of affairs. The portraits on the walls were the previous generations of the Vance family, looking down with the composed expressions of people who had been painted specifically to look like the kind of people whose descendants would have a large library and a good desk, and a will that was read by a family attorney with 11 years of experience who was not prepared for this. In the library on the 14th of October, after Prescott had read the condition, there was a silence that was longer and more specific than any silence he had previously managed in 11 years of reading wills. Then Silas Vance's eldest son, Robert, said, "He has lost his mind." Prescott said, with the professional delicacy of a man who has practiced this particular kind of delicacy for 11 years. The document was drawn under conditions that I observed personally. Mr. Vance was in full possession of his faculties at the time of the document's preparation. Robert said, "Then explain the condition." Prescott said, "I cannot explain the condition. I can tell you that the condition is legally expressed, and that the will as a whole is valid, and that you have 1 year to determine whether you wish to comply with the condition." There were 5 people in the room besides Prescott. Robert Vance, the eldest son, 40 years old, the person who had expected, since his father's illness began, to inherit the Vance estate with the straightforward simplicity of a firstborn son's expectation, and who was now recalculating. Margaret Vance, Robert's wife, who had her own relationship to calculation and who was very still in her chair. James Vance, the second son, 34, who was watching his brother with the specific quality of a second son watching a firstborn recalculate. Eleanor Vance, James's wife, who was watching her husband. And Charlotte Vance, the only daughter, 26, unmarried, who was sitting in the chair nearest the window and who was not watching anyone. She was looking at the will on the reading table. She had been looking at the will since Prescott read the condition. She was the only person in the room who was looking at the document rather than at the people. She was looking at the document with the specific quality of someone who is reading rather than reacting, who is in the text rather than in the room, and who is finding in the text something that the others are not yet looking for. Prescott would note this later in his own private journal, which he maintained as a personal record of the more unusual episodes of his professional practice. He would write, "Miss Charlotte Vance was the only member of the family who, upon the reading of the condition, looked at the document. The others looked at each other. She looked at the will. I do not know what she was reading in it that the reading had not covered." Charlotte Vance had been looking at things her family found inconvenient to have looked at since she was 14. This was not a quality she had cultivated deliberately. It was a quality of her attention, an orientation of her intelligence toward the specific details that the organized presentation of a thing was designed to move your eye past, the details that existed in the gap between what was presented and what was present. Her father had recognized this quality in her and had used it selectively. He had brought Charlotte into his confidence on specific matters over the years: the assessment of a proposed business arrangement, the evaluation of a new employee's account of himself, the specific question of whether a document he had received meant what it appeared to mean. He had valued her attention and had used it as a tool and had, simultaneously, ensured that the tool was not available to her for the application she would have most valued, which was the application of her attention to the full account of what the Vance estate was and how it had come to be what it was. She had applied it anyway. 8 years of attention, from the age of 18 to the age of 26, directed at the specific question of what the Vance estate was made of, not the question that the Virginia planter class thought was appropriate for a daughter of the family to ask, not the management of the domestic sphere, not the social calendar of the county, not the question of her own marriage and the alliances it might produce. The question of the estate's foundation, which was a question that the estate's foundation had been specifically designed to not be asked. She had found most of the answer before her father died. The library, which Silas had filled with the specific purchases of a man who understood that a library expressed an educated mind, contained in its rows and rows of carefully selected volumes a gap. The specific gap of a collection that had been curated to exclude a category. No records of the specific commercial operations that had produced the fortune from which the library had been bought. No accounts of the Atlantic trade that had produced the capital from which the Virginia land and the Virginia house and the Virginia tobacco operation had been acquired. The library had the law books and the natural philosophy and the agricultural manuals and the histories and the literature. It did not have the ledgers of the slave ship that had been the Vance family's first instrument of accumulation, because those ledgers had not been kept in the library and had been kept somewhere else, which Charlotte had found in the 3rd year of her looking. She had read them. They were specific and complete and kept with the care of a merchant who understood that a thorough record was the foundation of a profitable enterprise, and who had not distinguished, in the keeping of his records, between the cargo categories of the voyages they documented. She had read the specific vocabulary of the ledgers, which was the vocabulary of the transatlantic slave trade in its most functional and least reflective form, and she had read the financial history of the Vance estate from its first foundation in the specific commerce that the ledgers documented, and she had understood at the end of the reading what the Vance estate was made of. She had understood this for 3 years before her father died and left the will and the will's condition. In the library on the 14th of October, after Prescott read the condition, she was looking at the document not for what the reading had covered, but for what the reading had not covered. She was looking for the why, for the specific reason that Silas Vance had arrived at the conclusion that his bloodline's blindness was necessary, because the condition was not the act of a madman, and was not the act of a grieving mind or a failing one, and was not, she was certain, the act of anything other than deliberate calculation. Her father had been a deliberate man in everything he had done, from the first voyage to the specific calibration of the will, and the condition was deliberate. She needed to understand the deliberateness. She found the understanding in the letter. The letter was not in the will. The will was the public document, the document Prescott had read, the document that the family had received, the document that would be recorded in the county records and that would govern the disposition of the Vance estate. The letter was private, addressed to Charlotte specifically, left in Silas's desk in the room he had kept locked in the last years of his life, and that she had accessed on the morning of the 15th of October with the key she had found in his clothing at the laying out. The key she had taken without telling anyone she had taken it. The letter was written in Silas Vance's own hand, not the scrivener's hand of the will. It was written in the specific hand of a very old man at the end of his strength. Not illegible, Silas had been too precise for the decay of his hand to make his writing illegible, but shaking slightly, the specific quality of handwriting produced under the physical conditions of dying. It was 7 pages. She read it in the locked room at the desk by the morning light. He said, "Charlotte." He used no further salutation. He said, "You are going to be the one who looks at the condition directly. I know this because I know you. The others will look at each other and calculate. You will look at the document. You will find this letter because you will find the key and you will go to the desk and you will open it. Because you have been looking in the places you are not supposed to look since you were 14 years old and you have not stopped, and I know this." He said, "The condition is not madness." He said, "I want you to understand this before you understand anything else. The condition is the most rational thing I have done in 61 years. He said, "You are going to disagree with this. You are going to find other words for the condition. Read to the end before you find those words." He said, "I want to tell you what I saw," he told her. In the last 5 years of his life, from approximately 1793 to his death in 1798, Silas Vance had begun to see things that the other people around him did not see. He did not say this to anyone during those 5 years, because he was a man who understood the specific risks of saying that you were seeing things that others were not seeing, which were the risks of the invalid, the fool, and the lunatic. And he was none of those things, and he was not going to be categorized as any of them. He kept the seeing to himself, and he tried to determine what the seeing was. The seeing was specific. It was not the general deterioration of the senses that he understood was a feature of advanced age, the blurring of the near vision and the dimming of the edges. It was a specific addition to his seeing, a quality of clarity that arrived in certain conditions, specifically in the specific quality of light that occurred at dawn and in specific reflected light. And what the clarity showed him was what the other light, the amber warmth of the candlelight and the flattery of the afternoon sun, had been preventing him from seeing. He said, "It began with my hands." He said, "In the winter of 1793 I was in the study before dawn, and the light was coming in from the east window, and it fell across my hands as I was reading, and I looked at my hands in that light, and I saw them clearly for the first time in years." He said, "I had been looking at my hands for 61 years, and I saw them clearly for the first time in that light, and what I saw was what my hands were, which was the hands of the man who had done what I had done." He said, "I do not mean this in the spiritual sense." He said, "I am not a man given to spiritual seeing." He said, "I mean it in the most literal physical sense available." He said, "I saw in my hands, in the specific clarity of that light, the specific record of what they had done." He said, "I do not have the language for this that is not spiritual language, and since I do not believe in spiritual language, I am going to say it plainly and let it be plain. My hands looked like what they had done." He said, "There was nothing on them that had not been there before, but the light showed me what was there in a way that the other light had not been showing me, and what was there was the record of the 60 years of decisions that had made the Vance estate what it was." He said, "I looked at my hands every morning after that in the specific dawn light and I saw the same thing." He said, "I began to look at other things in the same light." He said, "The house, the estate, the people." He said, The light showed me what they were, what the estate was, what the people, all of the people, the family and the workers and the specific human material of the Vance estate's operation, what they were in relationship to what I had built. He said, I saw clearly, Charlotte, for the first time in 61 years, what I had built. He said, I had been looking at it every day and I had not seen it. The light that surrounded the estate, the amber of the house's lamps and the flattery of the afternoon sun on the formal garden, had been preventing me from seeing it. He said, the dawn showed me what the other lights had been conceding. He said, this is what I saw every morning for 5 years. He said, I did not want to see it. He said, I made every effort to avoid the dawn light and to remain in the other light, and the other light was adequate for the avoidance. He said, but I knew what the dawn light had shown me. He said, I knew it, and the knowing did not go away with the avoidance of the light. He said, the condition in the will is not punishment. He said, I want you to understand this. The condition is not my punishment of the bloodline for what I did. He said, the condition is my protection of the bloodline from the specific experience of seeing what the dawn showed me. He said, I do not want my children to see what I saw. He said, I do not want my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren or any person of this bloodline to be in the position of standing in the dawn light above the Vance estate and seeing clearly what it is. He said, the blindness is the specific mechanism of protection from this clarity. He said, I am giving you the choice. He said, you can comply with the condition and receive the inheritance and remain in the amber light and not see the dawn showing. He said, or you can look. He said, if you look you will not receive the inheritance. The condition is the condition. He said, I know you are going to look. He said, I am going to tell you what you will see. He told her. He wrote it in the 7 pages, and he was specific, and he was the most honest he had ever been in his life. In the 7 pages of the letter to Charlotte in the locked room, he wrote what the dawn had shown him, in the specific language available to a man of 61 years at the end of his life, who had been carrying the seeing for 5 years, and who had decided, in the last calculation available to him, that the right place for the truth was in a letter to the daughter who was going to look anyway. He wrote the full account of the Vance estate's foundation. He wrote it in the specific clarity of the dawn's showing, which was the language he had available for it, not the ledger's vocabulary, which was the vocabulary of management, but the vocabulary of what the dawn showed, which was the vocabulary of the full and specific human account of what the Vance estate's commerce had been, and what it had done, and who it had done it to. He wrote it to Charlotte, who already knew most of it, who had read the ledgers 3 years before, who was the daughter he had used as a tool, and who had used the tool on him, who had been looking at what he needed not to be looked at for 8 years, and who was, in the locked room on the morning of the 15th of October, 1798, reading the full account of it in her father's shaking hand. He said at the end, I am sorry, Charlotte. He said, I am sorry for what I built, and I am sorry for what the building required, and I am sorry for the specific cowardice of putting the protection of the blindness in the will rather than the account of what needed to be seen. He said, the condition was the cowardice. The condition is me making one more decision that keeps the bloodline from having to face what I faced. He said, I know you are going to face it anyway. He said, I am sorry I have left you to face it with no inheritance and no mechanism. He said, you will find the mechanism. He said, you always find the mechanism. He said, Charlotte, he said, look at it clearly. She folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She sat in the locked room for a while. Then she stood up and she went to the door and she unlocked it and she walked through the locked room's door and through the study and into the main hall of the Vance estate and out through the front door of the house. It was October. The Virginia dawn was still early in October, the light coming over the eastern hills with the specific quality that Silas had described. The neutral gray gold of the dawn that had no warmth in it. That was not the amber of the house's lamps and not the flattery of the afternoon sun. That was the light that showed what was there. She stood on the front steps of the Vance estate in the dawn light of the 15th of October, 1798, and she looked. She looked at everything. The house behind her, whose architecture she had grown up inside and whose every room she knew and whose beauty she had always accepted in the way that you accept the beauty of the house you were born in, without examining what the beauty was made of. The formal garden at the front, which had been maintained to the specific standard of the Virginia planter's formal garden, by the labor of people who had not been asked whether they wished to maintain it. The tobacco fields beyond the formal garden, the fields that produced the income from which the library had been bought, and the wills had been drawn, and the formal garden had been maintained. The slave quarters at the east side of the main block, visible from the front steps in the dawn's neutral light. The small buildings of the people whose labor was the mechanism of everything else visible from where she was standing. She looked at all of it in the dawn. She saw it. Not in the way her father had meant the seeing. He had described the dawn's clarity as a revelation, a specific supernatural or near supernatural quality of the light that had shown him what he could not otherwise see. What she saw was not a revelation. It was what she had always been able to see and had been seeing for 8 years, made fully present in the specific quality of the morning that had no amber warmth to soften it. She saw the estate in its full account, in the full account she had been assembling since 18, in the clarity of the specific light that showed what the other lights had been managing. She saw what it was. She had known what it was. She saw it. She stood on the front steps for a long time. The dawn moved past its first neutral quality into the warmer light of the morning. The estate's population began to stir, the first movement at the slave quarters, the first smoke from the kitchen building, the beginning of the day's labor that was the engine of everything she was standing in front of. She went inside. She went to the library. She sat at the reading table at the spot where the will had been read the day before, and she opened the journal she had brought from her room. She wrote, "My father ordered the blindness because seeing was the condition he could not manage. He had spent 61 years building a structure that required not being seen clearly, that depended on the amber light's management, and the formal garden's beauty, and the specific vocabulary of the ledgers, to prevent the full account from being assembled. He had built the structure, and he had maintained the structure, and in the last 5 years of his life, the dawn had shown him what the structure was, and he had not been able to manage the seeing. He ordered the blindness, because the blindness was the only mechanism he had available for preventing the next generation from having to manage the seeing." She wrote, "This was the cowardice, not the condition itself, which is wrong, but the reasoning that the protection of the bloodline from the discomfort of seeing clearly was a sufficient reason to impose the blindness. As if the discomfort of seeing was the problem, as if the seeing was what needed to be managed." She wrote, "The seeing is not the problem. The estate is the problem." She wrote, "I am going to refuse the inheritance." She wrote, "Refusing the inheritance is not the end of the accounting. Refusing the inheritance is the beginning of what the accounting requires." She wrote, "I have been looking at what the account says for 8 years, and the account says that the Vance estate's specific foundation requires a specific reckoning that is not met by the refusal of one daughter's inheritance." She wrote, "The refusal is the first mechanism. The full accounting is the work that comes after." She wrote this in the journal. She wrote it in the specific language of a woman who has been looking at things she was not supposed to look at for 8 years, and who has arrived at the place the looking was always heading toward, which was not the seeing itself but the using of the seeing, the specific act of taking what the dawn's clarity had shown and doing something with it that the amber light's management had been designed to prevent. She did not receive the inheritance. Robert received the inheritance on the condition that he arranged to be blind, which he did, in the specific way of a man who calculated the inheritance's value against the condition's cost and found the calculation in the inheritance's favor. He was blind by the summer of 1799, and he managed the estate blind for 12 years until his death in 1811, and the estate under his blind management was managed by the same mechanisms it had always been managed by, which were the mechanisms that did not require the manager to see clearly what the estate was made of. James received the inheritance on the same condition after Robert's death and was blind by 1812 and managed the estate blind until the war ended it. The bloodline went blind, generation by generation, through the first half of the 19th century. Each Vance heir made the calculation Silas had structured the will to produce, which was the calculation of the inheritance's value against the condition's cost, and each found the same answer. Charlotte found a different answer. She had always been finding different answers. The account of what Charlotte did with the different answer is not in the public record of Albemarle County, Virginia, which contains her father's will and the records of the estate's subsequent inheritance and management, and the county histories that list the Vance family among the prosperous families of the county in the antebellum period. The public record does not contain Charlotte. The account is in the journal she began at the library table on the morning of the 15th of October, 1798, which she continued for 43 years, until her death in 1841, in the specific form of a woman who had decided to use the full account that the dawn's clarity had assembled for her in 8 years of looking, and in the letter in the locked room. The journal is in the collection of the University of Virginia's Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library, acquired in 1962 with a collection of Albemarle County documents, and catalogued as Journal, Woman of the Vance Family, late 18th to mid-19th century. It was not identified as Charlotte Vance's until 1987, when a graduate student working on the history of Virginia testamentary law found the will's reference to the condition and traced the family's subsequent history and found, in the Virginia records, the reference to the journal's acquisition. The graduate student was the first person to read the full journal since Charlotte's death. The journal is what she did. It is 43 years of the work she described on the morning of the 15th of October as the full accounting that the condition had been designed to prevent. She had no inheritance, and she had no social position in the specific sense of a woman who has declined the family's wealth. And she had the specific freedom available to such a woman in the Virginia of the early 19th century, which was not much, and which she applied entirely to the work the journal documents. The journal is the account. The journal names the people. The journal documents what the Vance estate was and what it had done, and who had built it and who had maintained it, and what the specific human cost of its operation had been. Assembled from the ledgers and the estate records and the county records, and the specific archive that a woman with 30 years of careful looking can assemble from the materials available to her, even when the materials have been organized to not be assembled. She did not stop the estate. She did not have the mechanism for stopping the estate. What she had was the seeing and the journal is what she did with the seeing, and the journal is in the Special Collections Library where it has been since 1962, available to any researcher who requests it. The will of Silas Vance is in the records of the Albemarle County Circuit Court. It is available. The condition is in it. The condition reads exactly as it was read in the library of the Vance estate on the 14th of October, 1798, by the attorney Prescott, who was not prepared for it. The Journal of Charlotte Vance is in the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library of the University of Virginia. It is available. The question that Silas Vance constructed the will to prevent the bloodline from being able to answer, the question of what the Vance estate was built on, and what it had done, and what the full accounting of it required, is answered in the journal. Charlotte Vance spent 43 years assembling the answer. The answer is in the journal. Silas Vance ordered the blindness because seeing clearly was the one thing the estate could not survive. He had been right about this. He had been right about the seeing specific danger to the estate's survival, and he had been right about Charlotte being the one who would look, and he had been wrong about only one thing, which was that the blindness was protection. The blindness was not protection. The blindness was management. Charlotte looked. Charlotte saw. Charlotte spent 43 years writing down what she saw in the specific language of a woman who had always found the mechanism and who had found, in the morning of the 15th of October, 1798, the mechanism that 43 years of the full accounting required. She did not receive the inheritance. She received the dawn. The dawn was enough. The dawn is always enough. You can see clearly in the dawn, or you can receive the amber light's inheritance. You cannot do both. Charlotte chose the dawn. Silas Vance ordered the blindness because he had looked once and could not manage what he saw. Charlotte looked every morning for 43 years and wrote what she saw and left it in the journal for the researcher who came to the Special Collections Library in 1987 and found the will and found the journal and sat with both for a long time. The way you sit with things that have been waiting for you and that you have been, without knowing it, the person they were waiting for. The will is there. The journal is there. The dawn is available every morning if you choose it.